Judge rules against black woman stunned when she reveals she's a U.S. attorney. The courtroom was ice cold, not because of the air conditioning, but because of the judgment hanging thick in the air. Every eye was fixed on the woman standing alone at the defense table. Alicia Monroe, a black woman in her early 30s, no jewelry, no makeup, no lawyer, just her, standing straight, her shoulders squared against the weight of a room that had already decided she was guilty. From the moment she walked in, she felt it. The stares, the whispered comments, the smirks from the jury box. To them, she wasn't a professional. She was a poor black woman defending herself in a system built to crush people like her. The white bailiff didn't even meet her eyes when he gestured for her to stand. The courtroom clerk, an older woman with stiff hair and stiff eyes, looked at Alicia like she didn't belong. At the bench sat Judge Robert L. Hartwell, a man whose thinning gray hair was slicked back with authority, his gavel a tool not of justice, but of control. He adjusted his glasses, glancing down at the case file with disinterest before lifting his eyes to Alicia. His gaze was sharp but not curious, just dismissive. "Miss Monroe," he began, his voice slow and patronizing, "are you aware of the gravity of the charges brought against you?" Alicia nodded once, calm and composed. "Yes, Your Honor, I am." Her voice was steady, but her eyes, deep brown, framed by quiet exhaustion, revealed the storm beneath. Pain, frustration, and above all, restraint. Judge Hartwell sighed and leaned back in his chair. "You understand this is a criminal assault case. The victim, Mr. Charles Whitman, is a respected business owner. You've been charged with physically attacking him in a public parking lot, and you're choosing to represent yourself?" "Yes, Your Honor," Alicia repeated. A chuckle broke out from the spectators' bench, just loud enough to be heard, just short of being punishable. The judge didn't react. From across the courtroom, Prosecutor Daniel Merrick stood, a man oozing with self-importance in his tailored suit and gold watch glinting beneath the fluorescence. He cleared his throat theatrically. "Your Honor," he said, "I must object to the defendant's decision to proceed pro se. This case involves significant legal complexity. We're talking about physical assault, witness testimony, potential surveillance footage." "She has the right to defend herself," the judge interrupted, although not in Alicia's defense. He said it more like a warning. "You're making your bed, now lie in it." Alicia said nothing. She'd been here before. Not in this courtroom, not on these exact charges, but in this exact power dynamic. She had sat across from men like Merrick, under the gaze of men like Hartwell, too many times. But never like this. Never as the one being accused. Prosecutor Merrick turned to the jury and smiled as if the verdict was already signed. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is a textbook example of uncontrolled aggression. Mr. Whitman was leaving his office late at night. Miss Monroe, angered by a parking dispute, allegedly shouted at him, struck him, and left him on the ground." He paused for effect. "This wasn't an accident. This was a deliberate act of violence, a temper lost, a crime committed." Alicia didn't move. She didn't flinch, but inside she burned, because she knew what they were doing. They were painting a picture, a dangerous woman lashing out, violent and unstable. And she couldn't help but notice how no one questioned why a successful businessman had been shouting at her in a dark parking lot. No one asked why the bruises didn't match an assault. No one cared that the surveillance footage conveniently cut off 10 seconds before the incident. The courtroom had fallen into a tense silence as the first witness took the stand. A white woman in her late 50s, dressed in a pale lavender blouse and clutching her handbag like a shield, cleared her throat nervously. Her name was Margaret Ellison, and from the moment she stepped into view, the mood in the room shifted. She looked like someone the jury could trust. She looked like someone who paid her taxes, attended church, and never missed a bake sale. And worst of all, she looked scared. Daniel Merrick, the lead prosecutor, walked up slowly, adjusting his tie with practiced flair. He gave the jury a warm, reassuring smile before turning to Margaret with the gentlest of voices. "Good afternoon, Miss Ellison. Thank you for being here today. I know this must be uncomfortable." Margaret nodded, her lips trembling slightly. "Yes, well, I just want to tell the truth." "That's all we want," Merrick said smoothly, before stepping back slightly to give her space. Now please tell the court what you saw the night of the incident. Margaret inhaled deeply. I was walking to my car in the lower lot behind my building. It was late, maybe around 9:30 p.m. The lights were dim, some of them were flickering, and I heard shouting. When I looked over, I saw a woman, her, she pointed at Alicia without hesitation, standing over a man lying on the ground. A ripple of whispers moved through the courtroom. Merrick nodded solemnly and began pacing slowly. And what did the woman appear to be doing? Margaret hesitated, looking uncomfortable. It looked like she had just attacked him. I mean, I didn't see her hit him, but it was loud, and he was on the ground, and she was just standing there over him. Standing over him, Merrick repeated, drawing the words out for dramatic effect. He glanced at the jury again. Thank you, Ms. Ellison. That'll be all. He turned and walked back toward the prosecution's table with the air of a man who believed he just won the case. But the moment Alicia stood, the air in the courtroom changed. She walked slowly to the witness stand. No theatrics, no emotion, just calm, careful steps. Ms. Ellison, Alicia began, her tone professional. You said it was dark that night? Yes. And some of the parking lot lights were not working? Yes, that's right. And you were? How far away exactly? I don't know, maybe 50 or 60 feet, Margaret said, frowning. In the dark, Alicia confirmed, and about 50 feet away. So you didn't see me make physical contact with the man. Is that correct? Margaret hesitated. No, I didn't actually see, but you assumed, based on the noise and his position on the ground? Margaret's voice lowered. Yes. Alicia paused, looking down at her notepad, then looked back up. Were you able to see what either of us was saying? Could you hear our words? Number, I could only hear yelling. I didn't hear the words. No further questions, Alicia said softly, returning to her seat. Judge Milton barely acknowledged her as he turned to Merrick. Next witness? But Merrick wasn't done. He rose again, full of swagger now, and turned dramatically to face Alicia. Miss Monroe, he said with mocking emphasis, I must admit, you handle yourself well for someone without a law degree. Alicia remained silent, unmoved. But let's not kid ourselves, he continued, walking slowly toward the jury. Reading a few articles on the internet and watching courtroom dramas doesn't make someone qualified to stand here. This isn't about pride. This is about facts. This is about the law. He pivoted, locking eyes with Alicia. You think you're better than us because you've memorized some legal terms? Alicia stood again, slowly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't sneer. But her words hit with the weight of someone who had tasted injustice before. I never said I was better than anyone, she said. But I know my rights, and I know that assuming guilt based on race, income, or lack of representation is not justice. It's prejudice wearing a robe. Gasps fluttered through the room. Even the judge blinked. Merrick, however, only smirked. Prejudice? He scoffed. Miss Monroe, you're not on trial because you're black. You're on trial because there's a victim who says you assaulted him and a witness who saw you standing over his body. Don't turn this courtroom into your personal soapbox. Alicia clenched her jaw, not because she was angry, though she had every right to be, but because no matter what she said, it was like screaming into a void. She had facts. She had logic. But the jury wasn't hearing her. They were watching her, judging her, weighing her demeanor like it mattered more than the truth. The judge cleared his throat, visibly impatient. Miss Monroe, return to your seat. She did quietly, folding her hands in front of her again. Daniel Merrick sat down slowly, his eyes never leaving Alicia. He wore a satisfied grin, as if he'd just landed the final blow. He knew the witness hadn't seen anything. He knew the testimony was circumstantial at best. But he also knew the game. He didn't need facts. He needed doubt. Doubt in a jury trained to believe that a woman like Alicia, black, alone, unrepresented, was always one breath away from violence. And so the courtroom moved forward, one unfair step at a time. The truth wasn't enough. Not yet. Not here. Outside the windows, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the wooden panels. Inside, Alicia sat still, calm, focused, but her hands trembled slightly in her lap. She knew what they were doing. She knew this wasn't about justice. It was about control. And they were doing everything in their power to remind her she had none. The courtroom doors creaked as Officer Gerald Knox entered and made his way to the witness stand. Tall, broad-shouldered, and clad in full uniform, he walked with the kind of authority that needed no announcement. His presence alone was enough to shift the energy in the room. People sat straighter. The jury leaned in. Even the judge appeared more alert. But Alicia Monroe didn't flinch. She kept her eyes fixed on the man who, with just a few words, could twist the truth into a noose. Prosecutor Daniel Merrick rose from his seat with visible confidence. He straightened his cuffs and approached the stand with a swagger born from knowing the deck was stacked in his favor. "Officer Knox," Merrick began, his voice calm and familiar, "you were one of the first responders to the scene the night of the incident, correct?" "Yes, sir," Knox replied, nodding. "And can you tell the court what you observed when you arrived?" Knox nodded again, already rehearsed. "We found Mr. Charles Whitman lying on the ground near his vehicle. He had a bruised arm and a scraped elbow. He appeared shaken, claimed he was attacked." "And did you question Miss Monroe at the scene?" Knox's face hardened. "Yes, we approached her for questioning. She was uncooperative. She refused to answer basic questions, wouldn't even tell us her name until we brought her in." Merrick tilted his head toward the jury. "So she refused to cooperate?" "She invoked her right to remain silent," Knox emphasized, with just enough disdain in his tone to color the words as guilt. Alicia stood, composed as always, but there was a storm behind her eyes. "Objection, Your Honor," she said firmly. "Exercising the right to remain silent is a constitutional protection, not evidence of guilt." Judge Milton didn't even lift his gaze from the file on his desk. "Sustained," he muttered half-heartedly. But the damage had already been done. The words were out. The jury heard them. The implication hung in the air like a bad smell. Merrick didn't miss a beat. "Officer Knox," he continued, "based on your experience, would you say the defendant's behavior that night was suspicious?" Alicia shot up again. "Objection. Speculation." Knox didn't wait. "Yes," he answered. "In my professional opinion, it was absolutely suspicious." This time the judge looked up. "Miss Monroe, I suggest you choose your objections wisely. You're not helping yourself." Alicia took a breath. Her voice was calm, but her jaw was tight. "He's providing a personal opinion to sway the jury, Your Honor. That's not testimony. That's bias." Judge Milton leaned back in his chair, clearly annoyed. "You may be familiar with legal theory, Miss Monroe, but this is a real courtroom, not a textbook. I advise you to start learning the difference." The words sliced through the silence. The spectators chuckled quietly. A juror smirked. One of the clerks actually rolled her eyes. The bailiff coughed, loud enough to almost sound like a laugh. And Alicia stood there, alone in a sea of people who had already decided she was guilty, not because of what she did, but because of who she was. The color of her skin, the simplicity of her clothes, the audacity of her self-representation. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She didn't plead for understanding. She simply sat back down, folding her hands in her lap, her posture straight. But her fingers trembled slightly, hidden beneath the table. Merrick continued his questioning, now emboldened. "And Officer Knox, did Miss Monroe offer any alibi at the scene?" She just asked for a lawyer. Wouldn't tell us anything." "And you found that uncooperative?" "Yes." Alicia couldn't stay silent anymore. She stood again, her voice sharper this time. "Your Honor, the Fifth Amendment gives me the right to remain silent. The Sixth gives me the right to an attorney. Exercising those rights is not refusing to cooperate. It is the very definition of due process." Judge Milton let out a loud sigh, then slowly turned to face her. His eyes were void of empathy. "Young lady," he said, "you clearly enjoy quoting the Constitution, but in this courtroom you need more than quotes. You need sense." Another chuckle, a louder one this time. Someone in the back whispered, "She's digging her own grave." Alicia sat down again, her face expressionless. But inside her chest burned, not from shame, but from the overwhelming weight of being unheard. Every time she opened her mouth to speak truth, the system bent to crush her. Every logical point she raised was brushed aside. Every right she exercised was twisted into guilt. It wasn't just unfair, it was a performance of injustice, and she was the unwilling star. The judge turned to Merrick. "You may continue." Merrick nodded, smugly victorious. He didn't need facts. He had perception. He had the badge, the uniform, the courtroom culture on his side. And Alicia? She had the law. But no one in that courtroom cared. The air in the courtroom had grown heavy, thick with tension, judgment, and something far more dangerous: assumption. Alicia Monroe sat silently at the defense table, her hands folded tightly in her lap, knuckles pale from pressure. Her case, layer by layer, had been reduced to a fragile skeleton of half-truths and biased testimonies. The prosecution had no hard evidence, just a nervous witness who couldn't see clearly in the dark, a police officer parroting prejudiced instincts, and a bruised man with a shaky story. No fingerprints, no video, no weapon, nothing concrete, but none of it mattered. Judge Gregory Milton cleared his throat, his fingers drumming against the polished surface of the bench. He looked tired, or perhaps just bored, as if Alicia's life was an inconvenience in his already overbooked day. "Both sides have presented their arguments," he said, tone clipped. "The prosecution has established a timeline, witness statements, and supporting officer testimony." Alicia opened her mouth, ready to protest, to remind him that the timeline was speculative, the witness saw nothing definitive, and the officer's statements were dripping in bias. But before she could speak, he raised a hand. "There will be no further interruptions," he warned, not even looking at her. Merrick stood smugly beside his chair, arms crossed. He didn't have to say a word. He could already see the finish line. The verdict didn't need to be earned. It had been pre-written. "And though the defense has raised questions," the judge continued almost begrudgingly, "it is the role of the jury to assess whether the evidence meets the threshold of reasonable doubt." Alicia stood now, her voice calm but urgent. "Your Honor, if I may, this case is built on assumption. The only evidence they have is speculative at best. That does not meet the burden of proof." The judge glanced at her with that same condescending glare he'd worn from the first moment she introduced herself without counsel. "I've heard enough, Miss Monroe," he said sharply. "This court will now proceed to jury deliberation." It was a gut punch, a decision not made on fact, but fatigue. Alicia's breath caught in her throat as a low hum spread through the courtroom. She looked around, at the jury, some of whom refused to meet her eyes, at Merrick, who leaned in to whisper something smug to his assistant, at the spectators, many of whom wore that same look of, "She probably did it." She felt her knees weaken, but she didn't sit. She couldn't. The injustice wasn't just in what they did, it was in how easily they allowed it to happen. She had played by the rules. She had cross-examined, cited the Constitution, exposed flaws in every statement, but none of it mattered. The system didn't need to crush her with force. All it had to do was ignore her. Just when it seemed like all hope was slipping away, Alicia made one final move, one last shot at the truth. And this time, she came armed with proof they couldn't ignore. Or so she thought. ChatGPT said, "The courtroom was a pressure cooker. Every glance, every breath, every sound tightened the atmosphere by another turn." Alicia Monroe stood at the defense table with something clenched in her hand, a single piece of paper. She held it like it was her last weapon, the final bullet in a battle she'd been fighting alone since the moment she stepped into this courtroom. Her voice, clear and steady, sliced through the silence. "Your Honor," she said, lifting the paper, "this is a certified medical report from County General Hospital. It states that Mr. Charles Whitman was intoxicated the night of the incident. Blood alcohol level, 0.14, nearly twice the legal limit." A murmur shot through the spectators. Even the jury seemed momentarily startled, shifting in their seats, eyes darting from the paper to Alicia to the prosecution's table. Alicia stepped forward, handing the document to the bailiff, who carried it to the bench. Judge Milton scanned it briefly, his expression unreadable. Then, before Alicia could say another word, Daniel Merrick stood. With that same smug, practiced smirk plastered across his face, he turned to the jury and then to the judge. "Well, isn't that convenient?" he said, voice dripping with sarcasm. A medical report that just magically appears on the final day of trial, produced by a woman who has no legal team, no formal counsel, and no prior submission to discovery? He turned, taking a few slow steps toward Alicia, his hands clasped casually behind his back. Miss Monroe, he continued, where exactly did this document come from? You didn't submit it before the trial. You didn't mention it during cross-examination. So forgive me for asking, but did you type this up at home? Maybe used a hospital logo from Google? A wave of snickers spread through the courtroom like wildfire. The laughter was sharp, smug, cruel. It echoed off the walls, bouncing off the wood-paneled decor like bullets. Alicia's face didn't change. Her spine remained straight, but her fingers clenched tighter at her sides. This report, she said firmly, was obtained through proper channels. I requested it directly from the hospital's legal department. It's signed by a licensed attending physician. The timestamp matches the night of the incident. She looked at the judge. This evidence is critical. It changes the narrative completely. Mr. Whitman wasn't assaulted. He was drunk and stumbled. That explains the injuries. That undermines the foundation of their entire case. But Judge Milton didn't look impressed. He took off his glasses, pinched the bridge of his nose, and sighed heavily. Mr. Merrick is correct to question the timing, he said slowly. It's highly irregular to introduce new documents this late in the process, and without prior review. But Your Honor, Alicia interrupted, her voice rising just slightly for the first time. If the goal of this courtroom is truth, then you can't ignore evidence just because it's inconvenient. Judge Milton shot her a look that stopped the breath in her throat. Miss Monroe, he snapped, you will not lecture this court. She opened her mouth to speak again, but the judge slammed his gavel, once loud and final. Enough. The spectators were loving it. Some leaned forward, eager to see the arrogant self-defender put in her place. A few chuckled. One older man muttered, should have hired a lawyer, just loud enough for the people around him to hear. And Alicia, still standing, felt the weight settle onto her chest like a brick wall. She'd done everything right. She'd found the truth. She had it in her hands. But the system didn't want truth. The system wanted order, obedience, compliance. Merrick returned to his table, smiling like a man who'd just stepped on a flower, and called it justice. Your Honor, he said smoothly, given the document's late appearance and questionable chain of custody, I motion to disregard it entirely. Alicia turned quickly. You don't get to erase facts just because they don't fit your story. But the judge had already moved on. The motion is granted. The report will be excluded from the record. It was as if the world stopped spinning. Alicia's ears rang. Her arms felt numb. She looked at the jury. Half of them seemed confused, the other half indifferent. No one stood up for her. No one questioned the logic of dismissing key evidence because it arrived too late in a trial that hadn't even been fair from the start. It wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was a stage, and the script had already been written. Alicia sat back down slowly. Her chair creaked under the sudden weight of silent fury. Her chest rose and fell, her face a mask of composure. But inside, she was on fire, because she knew this wasn't just about one report. It was about control, about power, about a system that bent over backward to preserve the illusion of fairness while quietly suffocating those who dared to speak without permission. She stared at the judge, who had already moved on to the next procedural note. And in that moment, Alicia Monroe understood something gut-wrenching. They weren't interested in the truth. They were interested in keeping her quiet. With her evidence dismissed, her objections ignored, and the weight of the courtroom stacked against her, Alicia realized there was only one thing left to do. Speak her truth, not for the court's approval, but for its reckoning. Alicia Monroe stood at the defense table, her face illuminated by a harsh beam of overhead light that felt more like interrogation than justice. She didn't ask for attention. She didn't raise her voice. But when she spoke, the room listened. Your Honor, she said softly but with unmistakable resolve. Before this court moves to deliberation, I'd like to address the jury. There was a pause, a moment of calculation from Judge Milton as he leaned back in his chair, the weight of the robe seeming to press heavier on him than usual. His fingers steepled. He didn't like her. That much was clear. but to deny her now after everything might look obvious. He gave a reluctant nod. You may proceed. Briefly, Alicia stepped forward, slowly, carefully, like walking through a minefield. Her heels tapped against the polished floor with quiet authority. She stopped at the center of the courtroom, directly between the prosecution and the jury, standing alone in a spotlight of judgment. She inhaled once, eyes sweeping across the jurors' faces. Some looked bored, some curious. One or two actually looked conflicted. My name is Alicia Monroe, she began, voice clear but raw. And for the past 3 days, I've stood here defending myself because no one else would. She paused, letting the words sink in. I've been talked over, dismissed, mocked. I've watched my rights twisted into weapons. I've seen evidence ignored and prejudice paraded as fact. Her voice cracked slightly, but it didn't waver. I'm not asking you for sympathy. I'm not asking for pity. I'm demanding what every person in this country is supposed to receive, a fair trial. She took a step closer to the jury box, locking eyes with a middle-aged woman on the front row, who immediately looked down. If I'm convicted today, it won't be because I assaulted anyone. It'll be because I didn't wear the right clothes, because I didn't have a lawyer, because I didn't smile enough, because I'm a black woman standing alone. Gasps rippled through the audience seats. Merrick shifted uncomfortably at his table. But Alicia didn't stop. If I had walked in here in a tailored Armani suit, white and well-connected, with a private legal team behind me, would I have been treated the same? She turned slightly, her voice rising, not in volume, but in purpose. Be honest with yourselves. If I were a white man in a $1,000 suit, would you have listened more carefully? Would you have asked more questions? Would you have doubted the shaky witness, questioned the biased officer, challenged the lack of hard evidence? She didn't blink. Or would you have needed less proof? A painful silence fell over the jury. A few of them couldn't meet her eyes. Others sat frozen, unable or unwilling to respond. One young juror, a man in his 20s, shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. A woman beside him wrung her hands beneath the edge of the wooden divider. You don't have to answer me, Alicia said, softer now, but you need to answer yourselves, because what happens in this room will echo far beyond me, beyond this case, beyond today. She drew in one final breath. Do not convict me because I didn't fit the picture of who you think deserves justice. Convict me only if you believe, beyond any reasonable doubt, that I committed this crime. She stepped back, her words still hanging in the air like gunpowder. Judge Milton's jaw was clenched. His fingers gripped the edge of the bench just a little too tightly. He waited a beat, 2, maybe 3, then finally spoke. Thank you, Miss Monroe, he said coldly. That's enough. No applause, no acknowledgement, just a gavel hitting wood like a bullet. This court is now in recess. The jury will retire to deliberate. Alicia didn't flinch. She returned to her seat in silence, but her words still echoed through the room, louder than any gavel ever could. The fight for justice is just beginning. More shocking twists are ahead. Don't miss a moment. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for standing for truth and justice. Where are you watching from? Let us know. Cornered, humiliated, and moments away from a verdict she didn't deserve, Alicia knew it was now or never. So she delivered her final, devastating blow. Just as the jury began to shift in their seats, preparing to rise for deliberation, Alicia Monroe stood. Her voice was clear, cutting through the tense air like a blade. Your Honor, I have new evidence, she announced, holding a flash drive in one hand and a sealed manila folder in the other. Judge Milton's eyes narrowed. This trial is moments away from closing. Unless it's earth-shattering, you are dangerously close to contempt. Alicia didn't flinch. It is earth-shattering. It's the truth, finally caught on camera. She turned to the bailiff and handed over the flash drive. Security footage from the convenience store adjacent to the parking lot. It was only recently recovered from their archive. The timestamp places it at the exact moment of the alleged incident. The bailiff brought the drive to the clerk, who quickly connected it to the courtroom monitor. The screen flickered. Everyone watched. What appeared was grainy but clear enough. The camera overlooked the rear of the parking lot, dimly lit and shadowed, but unmistakable in its scope. At 9:32 p.m., a man, Charles Whitman, stumbled into frame. He was alone. He swayed, clearly unstable. In his right hand, a half-finished beer can. Moments later, Alicia appeared on screen, several feet away, walking toward her car without urgency. Then suddenly, Whitman slipped, his foot landing squarely on a crushed aluminum can that rolled under his weight. His legs buckled, his body slammed to the pavement. Alicia turned at the sound but didn't rush over. She stood still, clearly startled as Whitman moaned and rolled onto his side. There was no contact, no confrontation, no assault. The room went silent, deadly silent. Alicia stepped forward. Exhibit A. She then held up the manila envelope. This is a certified medical report from County General Hospital. It verifies that Mr. Whitman suffered minor abrasions consistent with a fall, not an assault. There were no defensive wounds, no blunt force trauma, and no signs of external impact. Judge Milton looked down at the report after the bailiff placed it on his bench. He scanned it with furrowed brows, flipping through the notarized pages, silence thickening the room with each passing second. And then came the final blow. Alicia turned to the back of the courtroom. Your Honor, I'd like to call one final witness. He arrived just moments ago. The side door opened. A man in a security uniform stepped into the room. Tall, middle-aged, nervous, but determined. This is Kenneth Dawes, Alicia said. He's the night shift security guard for the building adjacent to the parking lot. He witnessed the entire event but was never contacted by investigators. Judge Milton sighed. We are beyond the timeline for new witnesses. Alicia pressed on. Please, you just watched a man fall on his own. This testimony will confirm it. After a long pause, Milton finally waved the man to the stand. Kenneth sat down, swore his oath, and adjusted the mic with trembling fingers. Mr. Dawes, Alicia asked gently, were you working on the night of September 12th? Yes, I monitor the back lot from the building's loading dock. I smoke out there. I've seen it all. Did you witness what happened between me and Mr. Whitman? Dawes nodded slowly. Yeah, he was already tipsy when he showed up, arguing with someone on the phone, loud. Then I saw him toss an empty beer can on the ground. He took a step, slipped on another can, and just wiped out. Did I touch him? Never. Did you see me assault him? You just stood there. Honestly, you looked more surprised than anyone. Merrick leapt to his feet. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. None of this was in the discovery process. This is a stunt. Your Honor, he began, his voice sharp and clipped. This submission is inadmissible. The defense has failed to present this evidence during the discovery process. Introducing such material at this late stage violates procedural fairness and denies the prosecution a chance to properly vet its authenticity. He turned to the jury, deliberately pacing. This is not how justice works. A courtroom is not a magic show where surprises are pulled from hats at the 11th hour. There are rules for a reason: structure, process, discipline, and this, he gestured toward the video screen in the medical report, is chaos, unverified, untimely, unacceptable. There were murmurs of agreement among some courtroom observers, but Alicia Monroe remained stone still. She didn't blink, didn't shift. She stood at the center of the room, the eye of the storm, and when she spoke, it was with the razor-sharp precision of a woman who had waited too long to be heard. Your Honor, she began, her voice unwavering, the prosecution is right about one thing. There are rules, but what he failed to mention is that those rules are meant to serve justice, not convenience. Her words hung in the air, slicing through the tension like a scalpel. The reason this evidence wasn't presented earlier is because I didn't have a team of investigators combing the scene. I didn't have subpoena power or a forensic unit at my disposal. I'm one person, alone, fighting a system designed to break people who can't afford to fight back. She stepped toward the jury box, her voice growing louder, not shouting but with a power that demanded attention. But let me ask this. Why didn't they find this evidence? Why didn't the prosecution pull security footage from the store next door? Why didn't they interview the building security guard who stood less than 20 feet away when the alleged incident occurred. Why didn't they confirm whether Mr. Whitman had been drinking? She turned slowly to face Merrick, her eyes locked on his. I'll tell you why. Because they weren't looking for the truth. They were looking for a conviction. Gasps echoed throughout the room. A few jurors glanced at each other. Others looked down, clearly uncomfortable. They built a narrative, Alicia continued, her voice hardening, one that fit the easiest, laziest explanation. Black woman, alone, no lawyer, must be guilty. She turned back to the judge. And now that the truth is inconvenient, now that the facts contradict their assumptions, they want it silenced. Merrick stepped forward, flustered now. Objection! This is a speech, not a legal argument. But Alicia didn't stop. They had weeks, Your Honor, weeks to investigate, to dig deeper. They didn't. I had days. I did. And I found what they refused to see. The judge's face was unreadable. He tapped his pen against the bench, staring at the video still frozen on the screen. Charles Whitman, slipping, arms flailing, no one touching him. Alicia took a final breath, her voice lowering, almost whispering. If justice means anything in this room, then this evidence cannot be ignored, not because of when it arrived, but because of what it reveals. The truth doesn't expire just because it arrives late. The courtroom fell silent once more. Merrick opened his mouth, then closed it again, visibly rattled. His arguments, once bolstered by performance and legal polish, now seemed brittle in the face of hard, undeniable truth. Judge Milton stared down at the stack of evidence before him. The surveillance footage, the certified medical report, and the sworn testimony of the surprise witness who had just rocked the prosecution's entire case. His fingers tapped once, twice against the bench, as if trying to summon clarity from chaos. Everyone waited. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, reluctant, but unmistakably clear. This court acknowledges that the new materials presented are highly relevant to the case at hand, he said. The surveillance video directly contradicts the prosecution's account of events. The medical report supports the claim that no physical assault took place, and the witness testimony corroborates both. Alicia didn't move. She didn't smile. She had no reason to celebrate, not yet. This wasn't victory. This was survival. The judge continued, his tone tinged with a reluctant gravitas. While the timing of this submission is far from ideal, it is the court's responsibility to ensure that no verdict is rendered without a full and fair examination of the facts. He looked up, meeting Alicia's eyes for the first time without disdain. This evidence will be admitted. A collective gasp passed through the room like a sudden gust of wind. From the prosecution table, Daniel Merrick stiffened, his jaw twitching as his carefully constructed case began to crumble. For days, he had relied on vague witness accounts, biased assumptions, and the court's willingness to look past the absence of concrete proof. Now that entire foundation had been shattered in a matter of minutes. But even as the gavel came down to formalize the decision, Alicia remained still, because the reality hadn't changed. Not truly. This courtroom had never been neutral ground. It had been a battlefield where she was expected to lose gracefully, and now that she had disrupted the script, people were scrambling to recover their roles. The judge's voice broke the silence once more. The jury will reconvene after 30 minutes for final instructions and deliberation. 30 minutes had passed, though it felt like hours. The jury had filed out in silence, leaving the courtroom in a suffocating stillness. Alicia Monroe sat alone at the defense table, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Around her, the gallery murmured in hushed tones. The weight of the moment pressed down on every surface, every breath. This was the final act, but no one could predict how it would end. The door at the back creaked open. All conversation ceased. The 12 jurors re-entered, single file, with measured steps and guarded expressions. No one smiled. No one fidgeted. They took their seats with the solemnity of people who had just stared down something heavy, something real. The foreperson, a woman in her 40s with silver streaks in her hair, held a folded slip of paper in her hand. Her fingers trembled just slightly. Alicia didn't blink. She didn't move. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her posture remained rigid, unbroken. She had come this far, through mockery, through systemic doubt, through a trial that felt more like an execution than a search for truth. She wasn't sure what justice looked like anymore, but she knew what injustice felt like. She had lived it. Judge Milton cleared his throat, visibly tense now. His once commanding presence seemed smaller, uncertain. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreperson stood. We have, Your Honor. The bailiff stepped forward, took the paper from her hand, and delivered it to the judge. Milton read it. His eyes didn't move. His lips didn't twitch. He was a man who had expected one ending, and now the script had changed. He exhaled sharply and handed the paper back to the bailiff. Will the defendant please rise? Alicia stood. Time slowed. Every camera in the gallery focused in. Every eye watched. Even Daniel Merrick, the prosecutor who had once looked so smug, so invincible, now sat pale-faced, frozen like a man watching his empire collapse in real time. The foreperson cleared her throat. Her voice wavered for a second, but found strength. In the matter of the People versus Alicia Monroe, she began, on the charge of felony assault. Alicia's breath caught. 1 second stretched into eternity. We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty. For a heartbeat, no one reacted. Then the sound hit, like a dam breaking. Gasps, whispers, stunned silence quickly overtaken by a wave of murmurs. The spectators, who had spent the trial scoffing and doubting, now stared with disbelief. Some looked down in shame. Some avoided Alicia's gaze altogether. But one thing was clear. The lie had unraveled, and they had witnessed it. Daniel Merrick sat still, his jaw slack, his face drained of color. He didn't object. He didn't stand. He simply looked broken. The certainty he'd carried so confidently through every word of his case had turned to dust in the span of one sentence. Judge Milton blinked once, twice, as if trying to make sense of what had just happened. This court thanks the jury for their service, he said slowly, mechanically. You are hereby dismissed. He didn't look at Alicia. Not once. The gavel came down like a reluctant surrender. Alicia exhaled, but she didn't collapse. She didn't cry. She stood tall. Not because she hadn't been hurt, but because she refused to let the system see her broken. A woman in the gallery clapped once, tentatively, then another. Then the room began to stir, not with celebration, but with realization. They had almost convicted an innocent woman. They had almost let the system swallow her whole, and it had taken every ounce of her strength, intelligence, and courage just to survive. Merrick finally stood. He looked at Alicia across the courtroom, not with apology, not even with hate, but with something far more dangerous, confusion, as if he still couldn't understand how the story hadn't ended the way he'd planned. Alicia turned and walked out of the courtroom. The heavy courtroom doors creaked open as Alicia Monroe stepped into the hallway, the air outside the chamber feeling somehow thinner, freer, but no less intense. The verdict still echoed in her ears. Not guilty, yet the battle scars remained fresh on her face, in her posture, and deep within her chest. It was over, yes, but the war she'd been forced to fight alone had left its mark. The moment she crossed the threshold, the flash of cameras exploded like a wave of white heat. Microphones lunged toward her. Reporters swarmed, some shouting questions, others holding back with wide-eyed awe. The hallway, once cold and sterile, had become a frenzy of movement and noise. Miss Monroe, how does it feel to be exonerated? Did you ever think the jury would side with you? Do you believe the justice system failed you? She kept walking, calm and poised, as if she hadn't just stood trial for a crime she didn't commit, as if she hadn't nearly been crushed under the weight of a courtroom built on quiet bias and loud procedure. Her silence was stronger than any speech. Then one voice cut through the noise. A young reporter, no more than 25, his suit too big for his frame, but his tone eager. Miss Monroe, he called out, after what you just endured, would you consider studying law? Maybe become a lawyer? Alicia stopped. The crowd quieted. Cameras focused, microphones stretched even closer. She turned to face the reporter, her eyes sharp yet not unkind. And then, with a calm that silenced even the furthest corner of the hallway, she answered. I already did, she said. I'm a U.S. attorney. For a second, no one reacted. The words hovered in the air like a suspended verdict. Unbelievable, undeniable. I've prosecuted organized crime, she continued. I've stood in federal courtrooms. I've cross-examined drug lords and white-collar criminals with more money than God. The crowd froze. But this, she said, her voice tightening with emotion, this was the first time I stood in a courtroom completely alone. No title, no badge, no team, just me. Her eyes scanned the press, then turned toward the courtroom doors behind her. And I had to ask myself, if I didn't have a resume, if I didn't carry a title, if I wasn't someone with status, would I have been heard at all? Gasps swept the crowd like a cold wind. Murmurs rippled. Someone dropped a notebook. Another whispered, "Did she say U.S. Attorney?" Inside the courtroom, the noise seeped through the door. Judge Milton had paused mid-sentence, his pen frozen in his hand. Daniel Merrick stood speechless, the reality of what he had just done, or nearly done, hitting him like a tidal wave of shame. Outside, Alicia wasn't finished. If I hadn't fought every second of this trial, if I hadn't uncovered the footage myself, if I hadn't called that witness, tracked that medical report, stood up again and again while the system tried to shut me down, would any of you be standing here now, asking me questions, or would you have walked away the moment the cuffs clicked around my wrists? There was no triumph in her voice, only truth. Undeniable, uncompromising. I wanted to see what the system looked like when I was stripped of everything except my voice. And I saw it, all of it. She stepped forward, the wall of reporters parting without hesitation. And now you've seen it too. The crowd stood in stunned silence. Not because Alicia had just revealed her identity, but because she had revealed theirs. Their assumptions, their doubt, their failure to question a single narrative until the woman they'd nearly written off forced them to see her. Alicia didn't wait for another question. She didn't need to. She walked away, head held high, past the cameras, past the questions, past the reporters who now stood stunned in the hallway, like statues in a museum of misplaced judgment. Justice had spoken in the courtroom, but Alicia Monroe had delivered the real verdict, and it was unforgettable. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Alicia Monroe stepped through the glass doors of her downtown office, exhaustion pulling at her shoulders like invisible weights. The familiar chaos inside felt distant, muted somehow, as if her previous courtroom battle had drained all color from the world. But before she could even place her bag down, Jasmine, her assistant, hurried forward, a thick manila folder in hand, worry etched across her young face. "Alicia, this just came in," Jasmine said urgently, pushing the file into Alicia's hands. "A woman named Elena Carter, single mother, 2 kids, about to lose her apartment despite never missing a rent payment." Alicia opened the folder slowly, scanning the pages. Her pulse quickened. Rent receipts, eviction notices. Each page screamed injustice. Jasmine watched her quietly, then whispered softly, "They're forcing her out for a new luxury development. She's not alone. Dozens of families, Alicia." Alicia's jaw tightened, a familiar fire reigniting in her eyes. "Who's behind this?" Jasmine hesitated briefly. "Walker Properties, deep connections, city council, the police, even the courts." Alicia lifted her eyes from the file, her voice low but powerful. "Then it's time someone stood up to them." Within hours, Alicia sat across from Elena Carter in a tiny coffee shop, steam rising from untouched cups. Elena's trembling fingers wrapped around a bundle of documents, her voice shaking as she explained, "I did everything right, paid on time, kept the place spotless. But then they came, threats in hand, and told me I had 30 days. My babies have nowhere else to go." Alicia reached across the table, steadying Elena's shaking hand. "You're not alone anymore, trust me." In the days that followed, Alicia uncovered the depth of corruption with ruthless efficiency. She visited neighbors, knocked on doors, stayed awake long past midnight studying decades of real estate records. Every paper trail led to the same truth. Powerful interests conspiring to evict working-class families, replacing homes with gleaming towers that sparkled with greed. Yet with every step closer to the truth, resistance intensified. Late one night, Alicia's phone rang. A distorted voice whispered threats through the static, chilling her to the bone. "You're digging too deep, Monroe. Back off, or else." She hung up, heart racing, but the threat only strengthened her resolve. The next morning, Alicia walked into court, armed with evidence and an unwavering determination. "I'm filing a class action lawsuit against Walker Properties on behalf of Elena Carter and 47 other families illegally targeted and evicted," she declared before the judge, her voice clear and unyielding. "We have proof of systematic fraud, threats, and corruption involving city officials." Walker's attorneys fought viciously, smearing Alicia in newspapers, painting her as a troublemaker, exploiting vulnerable residents for personal glory. Anonymous notes appeared at her doorstep. Her car tires slashed. Still, Alicia did not waver. She fought back with facts, each meticulously gathered document forming an undeniable truth. One stormy evening, as she sorted files alone in her office, a shadow fell across the doorway. She glanced up sharply. Detective Reynolds stood there, face somber. "You're stirring up powerful enemies, Alicia," Reynolds warned. "They'll stop at nothing to silence you." "Then let them try," Alicia shot back defiantly, "because I won't let these families be crushed beneath their greed." Reynolds sighed deeply, handing her a flash drive. "This proves it all. Bank transfers, bribes to police chiefs, city council payouts. Take them down." In court, the revelations detonated like bombs, shattering the veneer of legitimacy Walker Properties had carefully crafted. Bank statements showed massive payments exchanged for evictions. Emails detailed systematic manipulation between city officials, law enforcement, and developers. The corruption web unraveled spectacularly, piece by piece, leaving the jury visibly stunned. Alicia delivered her closing argument with passionate intensity. "This case isn't just about Elena Carter. It's about every family torn apart by powerful men who believe laws don't apply to them. It's about people deemed disposable simply because they lack wealth or status. Justice must never be reserved for the highest bidder." When the jury returned, every eye in the courtroom fixed upon them. The four persons stood, delivering the verdict with trembling hands yet unshakable clarity. "We find Walker Properties liable on all counts. We award damages to the plaintiffs and order an immediate halt to all evictions and construction projects." Alicia's heart soared. Around her, the families cheered, wept openly, embracing one another. Elena Carter clung to Alicia's arm, her tears mixing with relieved laughter. For one moment, hope overshadowed injustice. The fallout came swiftly. Walker's CEO arrested. City officials resigned in disgrace. Police chiefs investigated. Newspapers headlined "Corruption Exposed," praising Alicia as the hero who'd toppled giants. Yet amid the celebration, Alicia stood quietly, gaze distant. Cameras flashed relentlessly as reporters swarmed, eager for a triumphant speech. One journalist stepped forward, microphone raised, asking eagerly, "Ms. Monroe, after exposing corruption at this scale, you're hailed as a hero. How does it feel to become famous overnight?" Alicia paused, her eyes meeting Elena Carter's gaze in the crowd, the woman who trusted her with everything. Then she turned back to the cameras, speaking calmly but resolutely. "I never wanted fame. Fame fades. Fame distracts. All I wanted, what I still want, is real justice. Because justice isn't a headline or a photo op. Justice is dignity restored, homes protected, families safe. If we forget that, all of this means nothing." The silence afterwards spoke louder than any applause. Weeks later, citywide investigations unfolded. Alicia's courage inspired whistleblowers to come forward, dismantling networks of corruption that had hidden comfortably behind closed doors. Elena Carter and countless others stayed in their homes, building lives unthreatened by greed. Late one evening, Alicia stood by her office window overlooking the city, quiet streets reflecting softly in the glow of street lamps. Jasmine stepped in gently, hesitant to disturb. "Alicia, you did it. You changed everything." Alicia smiled faintly, eyes still fixed on the world beyond the glass. We changed it, Jasmine. Together. Her assistant nodded thoughtfully. They're calling you fearless now. Alicia shook her head gently, turning to face her assistant fully. Fearless? Courage doesn't come from being fearless. It comes from deciding something matters more than your fear. Outside, rain began to fall softly, cleansing the city streets below. Alicia knew this fight was far from over. But tonight, the storm had passed. And for now, justice had found its voice. Strong, clear, and undeniable. The courtroom doors closed behind Alicia Monroe, their heavy echo resonating through the empty corridor. She stood for a moment, her breathing steady yet heavy, as if the very air around her had thickened. The silence wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, a stark reminder of the battles she'd fought. The weight of every prejudiced stare, every dismissive remark, every assumption of guilt that had nearly broken her spirit. She had won, yet victory had not erased the scars. Alicia stepped forward slowly, the soles of her shoes clicking softly against the polished marble. Her reflection glanced back at her from the pristine glass panels lining the hallway. Strong yet weary, resolute yet vulnerable. In that moment, her reflection was more than just a physical mirror. It was the reflection of every marginalized voice silenced by power, wealth, and prejudice. She paused near a tall window, looking down upon the city streets below, crowded with people oblivious to the life-altering battle that had unfolded mere feet away. Below her stood a society, its traffic moving like clockwork, seemingly orderly yet riddled with hidden injustices. Alicia knew intimately how easily the mechanisms of power could crush those without a voice, without resources, without status. She remembered vividly how close she had come to losing everything, not because of guilt or wrongdoing, but simply because of who society saw when they looked at her. A black woman without legal counsel, a defendant representing herself, underestimated, mocked, ignored. Every step had been a climb uphill, dragging chains of bias heavier than iron. Alicia Monroe had been an attorney, a federal prosecutor no less. Yet none of that prestige had mattered when stripped of her title. Without her badge of status, the system had tried its hardest to silence her. If even someone like her, who knew the rules in the game, could be so easily dismissed, what chance did others stand? She pressed her palm against the cold glass, her fingers trembling slightly, betraying the emotion she had fought hard to keep contained. Today's victory wasn't just personal, it carried a deeper meaning, a haunting revelation about society's fundamental flaw. Justice was not blind. It saw clearly, discriminated openly, judging first by wealth, power, and skin color, and only afterward by truth or evidence. She knew this was a lesson she could never forget, one she must ensure others learned too. This case, these weeks spent fighting alone against an unjust system, had not simply exposed flaws in the legal process, it had revealed a hidden disease at the very heart of humanity. Prejudice and injustice thrived not in shadows, but in plain sight, protected by complacency, shielded by privilege. Alicia drew a slow breath, turning away from the window as footsteps approached her from behind. Jasmine, her assistant, approached quietly, eyes wide with respect, pride, and a hint of sadness. "You did it, Alicia. You changed things. People are already talking," Jasmine said softly. Alicia nodded slowly. "But will they remember? Or will this moment fade? Just another headline quickly forgotten." Jasmine looked at her thoughtfully. "You showed them truth. That can't fade, not easily." Alicia met her assistant's earnest gaze. "But truth alone is fragile. It needs guardians, people brave enough to defend it, even when it costs everything." She stepped closer, conviction clear in every movement, every word. "What happened to me happens every day to people who can't fight back, who don't have cameras following their stories, who don't get dramatic courtroom victories. They simply disappear into the cracks. Justice should never depend on fame, money, or status. It must be universal, or it is worthless." Her voice echoed softly in the corridor, quiet yet fierce, laden with a depth of emotion only those who truly suffered injustice could grasp. Alicia felt her heartbeat quicken as a newfound mission crystallized in her mind. A duty not only to fight for those silenced, but to make society recognize its own biases, its own injustices. We must fight every injustice as if it's our own, she continued quietly, yet with intensity. Because in reality it is. When justice fails one person, it fails us all. Every false accusation, every innocent silenced, every judgment clouded by prejudice is a wound in the collective soul of humanity. Jasmine nodded, listening intently, moved by the clarity and power in Alicia's voice. The trial today was not just about me, Alicia pressed on, her voice rising in passionate determination. It was a trial of the system itself, a system that so easily discards those it considers weak or inconvenient. And the system failed, not because it wanted truth, but because it underestimated someone it thought powerless. But not everyone can fight back as I did, and that is the tragedy. Alicia felt an urgency now, an almost physical force compelling her forward. Her hands clenched into fists, driven by the memory of every dismissive glance, every mocking laugh in the courtroom. Today must be more than just a victory for Alicia Monroe, she said fiercely. It must become a call to action, a challenge to every one of us to demand better, to dismantle prejudice, to hold power accountable, and to insist on justice that is truly blind. She paused, her voice dropping to a raw whisper, her eyes glistening with unspilled tears of resolve. We must recognize our responsibility to speak for those who cannot, to fight for justice not because it is easy or convenient, but because it is right, because silence is complicity and passivity is acceptance. In that silence, Alicia's words echoed like thunder, reverberating through Jasmine in the empty hallway. The young assistant's eyes filled with tears, moved deeply by the profound strength and vulnerability of her mentor. What you endured, Jasmine finally whispered, was unforgivable, yet you stood strong. Now they see. They have to see. Alicia gently placed a hand on Jasmine's shoulder, smiling softly, her expression bittersweet yet powerful. They see now, yes, but tomorrow we must remind them again. And again after that, because true justice is not a single victory, it's continuous vigilance. It demands courage every single day. She stepped forward, shoulders squared, strength radiating from her presence. The courtroom behind her had been a battlefield, but the war for justice was far from over. It was just beginning. Alicia Monroe knew now what her life had become: a living testament, a voice for those unheard, a beacon for those cast aside. And as she walked down that long corridor, her steps resolute, eyes forward, Alicia knew that no matter how challenging, how exhausting, or how isolating the journey ahead might become, she could never turn away. Because justice, real justice, was not about headlines or glory. It was about dignity, humanity, and truth. And that fight would always be worth every sacrifice, every battle, every hardship. She paused once more at the exit, glancing back toward the courtroom. In her heart, Alicia felt the weight of responsibility more intensely than ever before. Yet it was a weight she now embraced willingly, knowing what truly mattered. She opened the doors to the bright sunlight beyond, stepping boldly forward into a world that still needed her strength, her voice, and her unwavering courage. Because as long as injustice existed, Alicia Monroe knew exactly where she needed to be. Right here, fighting with everything she had. If Alicia's journey touched your heart, if her courage against injustice stirred something deep within you, then now is your moment to make your voice heard. Stories like hers matter because they highlight the struggles so many face quietly, hidden behind courtroom doors and systemic barriers. They remind us that justice isn't something we wait for. It's something we must actively demand. Every like you leave on this video amplifies Alicia's message of fairness and equality. It tells the world that you too stand against bias, corruption, and prejudice. Each comment you share lets us know how her fight resonated with you personally. Did you feel angry, inspired, empowered? Your voice matters, and your words can inspire others to take a stand. Subscribing to this channel means joining a community dedicated to truth, justice, and powerful storytelling. Here, every story seeks not just to entertain, but to ignite change, spark meaningful conversations, and challenge the silence surrounding injustice. By subscribing, you're standing alongside Alicia and everyone like her, showing them they are not alone. So please hit the like button, drop a comment below about your feelings, your thoughts, or your own experiences with injustice. And don't forget to subscribe to keep these vital conversations alive. Click the notification bell because every story deserves to be told, heard, and remembered. Together, we have the power to ensure that courage never goes unnoticed and that justice never becomes silent. Join us today because change starts here, with you. He thought no one could challenge him until he arrested a U.S. Army lieutenant colonel. The morning sun warmed the windshield of Tina Sanders' worn-out Corolla as she cruised through the quiet suburbs, heading to the Veteran Center, where she volunteered every Tuesday. In a simple hoodie and sweatpants, she looked like any ordinary citizen. But Tina was no ordinary woman. She was a retired U.S. Army lieutenant colonel with 22 years of service. Her rearview mirror caught the glint of the police cruiser, tailing her closer than necessary. Her pulse didn't race at first. She had nothing to hide. Her registration was current. Her speed was exactly the limit. No sudden lane changes, no expired stickers. But the longer the cruiser trailed her without passing, the more she could feel that familiar weight pressing down. That heaviness Black Americans have learned to carry in silence. It wasn't just a traffic stop. It was a warning. She pulled over calmly, placing both hands on the steering wheel like clockwork, just as she had taught young recruits during military police training. Engine off, seatbelt unclasped but not removed, eyes straight ahead, every move deliberate, every breath controlled. The door of the cruiser swung open and out stepped Officer Derek Langston. He walked with the swagger of a man who had never been told no, his belt heavy with authority, his sunglasses reflecting the morning sun, and a twisted smirk that crawled across his face like a storm about to break. "License and registration," he barked, without greeting or explanation. Tina met his eyes in the mirror, calm but alert. "Good morning, officer. May I ask the reason for the stop?" Langston's smirk widened. "You looked suspicious," he said, dragging out the last word like a challenge. "Driving slow, looking around, could be casing the neighborhood." "I'm on my way to the Veteran Center downtown. I volunteer there," she replied steadily. "Here's my license, registration, and my military ID." She handed over the documents slowly, her fingers steady, her voice firm. Langston glanced briefly at the items, then looked back at her, clearly unimpressed. "This military ID supposed to mean something?" "I served 22 years in the Army, sir," she said. "Retired lieutenant colonel. My name is Tina Sanders." Langston chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "Yeah, right. And I'm General Patton." Tina didn't flinch, but something in his tone chilled the air around her. The sarcasm, the condescension, the disbelief dripping from every word. This wasn't just routine. This was humiliation, weaponized. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," Langston said, placing one hand on the grip of his holstered weapon. "On what grounds, officer?" she asked, still not moving. "I haven't been informed of any violation." He stepped closer, voice rising. "Because I said so. Outside, now." She reached for her phone, placing it on the dashboard and hitting record. "I am complying, but I will be recording this interaction for my protection." Langston's face twisted. "Turn that damn thing off." "I have the right to record," she said firmly, unlocking her door and stepping out slowly. He didn't wait for her to fully stand. With unnecessary force, he yanked her left arm behind her back and slammed the cuff onto her wrist. The sharp click echoed down the street. A second later, the other cuff snapped shut. Her shoulder screamed in pain, but she didn't cry out. Across the street, a man paused his morning jog. A woman walking her dog stopped mid-stride. A pair of teens looked up from their phones. They all saw it. They all watched it happen. But none of them moved. None of them spoke. Tina stood on the sidewalk, wrists bound behind her back, face pointed downward, not in submission, but in seething control. Her breath was shallow, not from fear, but from the effort to keep herself composed. This was what 22 years of military discipline looked like under assault. This was the face of a warrior being shamed like a criminal. "You think you're above the law because you waved a fake military ID?" Langston sneered, gripping her arm tighter. You think that gets you out of a stop? That ID is real, she said through gritted teeth. And you're making a mistake. He laughed. The only mistake I made was not cuffing you sooner. The street was still. No sirens, no backup. Just the sound of his voice and the low hum of passing traffic. Tina's phone, still recording from the dashboard, caught everything. Every insult, every threat, every second of degradation. You're hurting me, she finally said, quietly but with steel in her voice. Langston leaned in, close enough for her to feel his breath. Good. He shoved her toward his patrol car, forcing her head down as he pushed her into the back seat like a sack of trash. Her knees hit the plastic floorboard hard. She winced but didn't make a sound. Not a single sound. Inside the cruiser, Langston slammed the door shut and turned to the watching crowd. Move along, he snapped, as if erasing witnesses erased the truth. As the cruiser door slammed shut behind her, Tina sat in the back seat, hands cuffed, knees bruised, heart steady. The engine roared to life, but it wasn't just taking her to a police station. It was dragging her deeper into the jaws of a system built to break people like her. The heavy metal door slammed shut behind Tina with a thud that echoed like a final verdict. The moment she stepped into the booking area of the precinct, she could feel that this wasn't about protocol. It was punishment. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, washing the room in a sterile, soulless glow. Tina stood still, handcuffed, her posture straight despite the pain radiating from her shoulders. 22 years in uniform had trained her to endure worse. But even a battlefield had rules. Here, there were none. Officer Derek Langston swaggered behind her, tossing her military ID onto the front desk like it was a piece of garbage. Got a real tough one here, he sneered, loud enough for every officer in the room to hear. Combative, possibly under the influence. We'll get the paperwork rolling. Tina's eyes flicked across the room. A few officers glanced up, and some of their faces faltered when they saw the bruises forming around her wrists and the calm, calculating look in her eyes. One younger cop badge reading Collins shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Another officer, a middle-aged woman sipping bad coffee, looked away entirely. No one asked why a woman wearing a veteran ID badge and no prior offenses had been dragged in like a common criminal. No one questioned the absurdity of the claims: erratic behavior, bloodshot eyes, strong odor of alcohol. Words Langston began typing into his report without hesitation, building his narrative like a shield against the truth. Tina was led to a cold holding cell, stripped of her belongings, including her phone still recording, and locked behind iron bars like she was a danger to society. No phone call, no lawyer, no explanation. Am I being charged with anything? She asked, her voice clear but firm. Langston gave a mocking laugh. You'll know when we decide. Behind the one-way glass, another officer muttered, This doesn't feel right. But he didn't move. No one did. Because Langston was the kind of cop you didn't cross, not if you wanted to keep your job, your shift schedule, your peace. Inside the cell, Tina sat on a metal bench bolted to the floor. The air was stale, thick with the faint scent of bleach and cold steel. Hours passed. Time blurred. There was no clock, no window, just the distant sounds of officers laughing down the hall and the occasional buzz of the intercom. She tried to focus, to center herself. Tactical breathing, she remembered from training. Inhale 4 counts, hold 4, exhale 4, hold 4. But it didn't help. This wasn't war. This was something more insidious. Every hour that passed chipped away at her humanity. The silence was deafening. The disrespect, louder still. She wasn't Tina Sanders, the veteran, the decorated officer, the leader who had commanded troops in foreign lands. She was just another nameless detainee in a broken system that thrived on silence and shadows. Langston's falsified report was already logged into the system. He claimed she had slurred speech, that she resisted arrest, that she attempted to reach for something under her seat, possibly a weapon. All lies, all typed with the confidence of a man who knew he would never be questioned. Back in the break room, Officer Collins finally spoke up. She doesn't look drunk to me, he said quietly. Langston scoffed. And I suppose you're an expert now? I'm just saying military ID checks out, and she was calm the whole time. Langston leaned in close. Let me give you some advice, rookie. You back your fellow officers. You don't second-guess them. That's how you survive in this place. That was it. The moment the room went colder, Collins fell silent. The message was clear. Speak up, and you'll be next. Back in her cell, Tina lay curled on the bench, refusing to show weakness, but struggling to stay warm in the thin cotton shirt they left her with. Her body ached. Her pride bled. But her mind was sharp. She replayed every moment from the traffic stop to the cuffs. She remembered the angle of her phone, the reflection of Langston's sunglasses in her rearview mirror, the jogger across the street. Every detail burned into memory like intel for a mission. No lawyer came. No explanation. Hours turned to night. She asked again to make a phone call. The officer on duty didn't even answer, just stared at her with empty eyes and turned away. This wasn't just about Langston. This was a system built to protect him, a network of fear, silence, and unchecked power. And Tina? She was now an anomaly, a threat to the unspoken rules. Around 3 a.m., the hallway lights dimmed, signaling a night shift lull. Tina hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. Her lips were cracked, her hands numb, but her eyes still burned with purpose. Langston walked by one more time, leaned against the bars with a smirk. You still think being some big-shot army officer means something here? Tina stared back, unwavering. Number. But I know what justice means, and I know this isn't it. His smirk faltered for half a second. Just a flicker, but it was enough. A crack in the armor. You'll be out when we're done processing. Maybe in the morning. Maybe not. He turned to leave. Get used to waiting. And then he was gone, his boots echoing down the hall like a drumbeat of institutional cruelty. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind Tina with a thud that vibrated through her bones. Tina Sanders had faced hostile territory before. She had led soldiers through bomb-strewn roads, held her ground under fire, and delivered commands with ice-cold precision in the chaos of war. But nothing prepared her for the brutal stillness of that holding cell. The air was colder than it had any right to be. It clung to her skin like wet linen, creeping through every layer of her clothing, stealing warmth and comfort with every breath. The metal bench bolted into the corner of the room was too short to stretch out on, too cold to sit on for long. She shifted from wall to wall, every movement deliberate, every second a battle against exhaustion. She had been there for hours. How many she couldn't say. There was no clock, no window, just flickering fluorescent lights that hummed incessantly and a steel door that refused to open. No one spoke to her. No one looked at her. She had vanished into the system, and the system wanted her forgotten. No food, no water, no phone call, just silence. The type of silence that doesn't just surround you but swallows you whole. Her stomach ached, the hunger gnawing like teeth. Her throat was dry, lips cracked, skin pale. She paced to keep her blood moving. Each step echoed against the concrete, the sound a dull reminder that she was alone. Her body screamed for rest, but she refused to close her eyes. Sleep would mean letting her guard down. She'd done that once, never again. They hadn't charged her, hadn't questioned her, hadn't even logged her arrest properly. She knew the playbook. This wasn't incompetence, it was intentional, designed to make her question reality, to turn discomfort into submission. But Tina Sanders didn't break. She recorded, memorized, calculated. The bruises on her wrists were deep now, swollen and tender from the too tight cuffs. Her shoulders ached from the way she'd been shoved, pinned, restrained like an animal. Every throb reminded her. They thought they could erase her identity in 16 hours, but they didn't know who they were holding. She stared at the surveillance camera in the corner of the room. A red light blinked steadily, watching, recording. She hoped it was live. She hoped someone, somewhere, would one day review the footage and see what they did. The silence, the neglect, the psychological warfare behind concrete walls. By the 12th hour, the cold wasn't just in her limbs, it had settled deep in her bones. She sat huddled in the corner, arms wrapped around her knees, rocking slowly to stay awake. Her jaw clenched to keep her teeth from chattering. She wasn't afraid. She was furious. This was supposed to be a country of laws, But here she was, detained, starved, isolated for what? For daring to exist in the wrong place, in the wrong skin, in the eyes of the wrong man with a badge. She thought about every young soldier she'd mentored, the lessons she'd drilled into them. Stay alert, stay disciplined, never lose your dignity. This was her test, and she would pass it. By hour 16, the door finally opened with a loud metallic groan. A disinterested officer stepped in, without looking her in the eye. "You'll be processed soon," he muttered, voice flat. Then he was gone. No apology, no explanation. Just a promise of more waiting. Tina stood up slowly, her body stiff and sore. But her eyes were alive with fire. They thought this room would break her. They were wrong. It built her case. It built her rage. And it built the exact kind of warrior the system should have never provoked. The sun had already risen by the time Tina Sanders was released. No apology, no paperwork, no charges. Just a grunt from the officer behind the desk and a plastic bag containing her belongings. Her legs felt like lead as she stepped out of the precinct and into the light. It should have felt like freedom, but it didn't. Her wrists still ached, her shoulders throbbed, and deep beneath her skin, where no camera could see, something had cracked not her spirit, but her trust. She didn't go home. She went straight to the clinic. The nurse took one look at her bruised arms and raised an eyebrow. "What happened?" Tina gave a tight, calculated answer. "Unlawful arrest, excessive force, no charges." The nurse didn't press, just nodded grimly and led her to an exam room. As Tina peeled off her sweatshirt, the damage came into full view. Angry purple bruises wrapped around both wrists like shackles that hadn't let go. A deep contusion bloomed across her upper arm, right where Langston had gripped and shoved her into the cruiser. She sat in silence as the nurse took photos for documentation. Flash, bruise, click. The lights of truth cold, clinical, undeniable. The doctor came in next, asked routine questions, did standard checks, blood pressure elevated, muscles strained, sleep deprivation evident. "I need an official report," Tina said, her voice sharp. "With images, dates, everything. I want it notarized." The doctor nodded. "We'll have it ready in an hour." Tina nodded back, but there was no relief on her face, just fire building behind her eyes. With the medical report in hand, she walked into the Civilian Complaints Division just before noon. The building was sterile, bureaucratic, designed not for justice, but for procedure. The front desk clerk barely looked up. "How can I help you?" "I'd like to file a formal complaint against Officer Derek Langston. Use of excessive force, false arrest. I have my medical documentation and video footage." The clerk blinked. That name clearly wasn't new, but instead of reaching for a form, she tapped her keyboard, eyes squinting at the screen. "Okay, she clicked again. "You said Langston?" "Yes, I was detained yesterday without charges. I want this filed immediately." A long pause. "Too long." The clerk gave a polite but hollow smile. "It looks like our system is having trouble pulling up your intake record." Tina's jaw tightened. "I wasn't processed. That's the point. I was held for 16 hours without documentation. That's the violation." Another pause. "Without an arrest report, it's difficult to file an internal complaint." "I was in your custody," Tina snapped. "In a holding cell. There is surveillance footage. There is my medical report. And I demand—" "I'm sorry," the clerk cut in, voice just a little too rehearsed. "But without a case number, the file cannot be created. Maybe it got misplaced during the shift change. These things happen sometimes." Tina stared at her, the calm before the storm. "Misplaced?" Her voice dropped to a chilling low. "I was unlawfully detained, assaulted, and now the record of that night, vanished. Do you think this is normal?" The clerk shifted uncomfortably, now avoiding eye contact. "Ma'am, I'm just following protocol." "No," Tina said flatly. "You're following silence." She turned and walked out, medical folder clenched in one hand, rage in the other. As the glass doors closed behind her, she didn't feel defeated. She felt dangerous. They hadn't just hurt her body. They had erased her from the system. But the betrayal didn't end at the precinct doors or the complaint office. What followed was quieter, more insidious. It wasn't just the system that turned its back on her. One by one, the people she trusted began to vanish. Not with violence, but with silence. She called Marcus, an old friend from her unit, someone she'd served 2 tours with. They'd fought side by side, watched each other's backs in firefights and foxholes. He didn't pick up. She tried again. Voicemail. The third time, the number was blocked. Then came the email from the Veteran Center, the place where she'd volunteered for nearly 2 years, where she helped others navigate their return to civilian life, where she'd mentored, led support groups, and cleaned bathrooms without complaint. Subject line, program update, polite, cold, final. Due to your current legal status and pending investigation, we must suspend your involvement with all center-related activities. This decision is non-negotiable and will be reviewed pending the outcome of your case. She read it 3 times, the words blurred. Not because of emotion, no. She was far beyond tears. It was the sheer disbelief. The center knew her record, knew exactly the kind of person she was. But that didn't matter anymore. A stain had been placed on her name, and no one was willing to risk getting it on themselves. The next blow came from an unexpected place. Her former commanding officer, Colonel Whitaker. He had once written a glowing recommendation for her, had called her one of the finest leaders I've ever had the privilege to serve with. She reached out to him. He responded with a single sentence. Tina, under the circumstances, I think it's best we not communicate for now. No explanation, no support, just abandonment, dressed in professionalism. And with each betrayal, the world around her grew colder. She walked through her neighborhood like a ghost. Parents pulled their children a little closer. Clerks at the local diner pretended not to see her. Every step outside her apartment felt like walking into a courtroom where the verdict had already been read. She wasn't just isolated. Rumors had already taken root. She must have done something. No smoke without fire. No one cared that there had been no charges. No one asked to see the bruises, the medical reports, the vanishing police records. Truth didn't matter. Optics did. Reputation was currency, and hers had been burned alive in front of her. Tina Sanders sat alone in her 1-bedroom apartment, surrounded by silence. Not peace silence, the kind that crept under doorways, filled every corner, and wrapped itself around the mind like a noose. The walls were stained from years of weathering humid summers and bitter winters. The heater clicked inconsistently, as if deciding moment to moment whether she was worth the warmth. A half-empty cup of coffee sat cold on the chipped countertop. The lights buzzed overhead. The world had moved on. She hadn't. Once her days were filled with purpose. Mission briefings, command orders, tactical maps, young soldiers looking up at her with steady respect. Now there were no orders, no uniforms, just a veteran with bruises that hadn't yet faded and a name they tried to erase. No job, no income, no one to call. The Veteran Center had cut ties. Her military contacts had gone dark, and her so-called friends had left her on red, their silence screaming louder than any betrayal ever could. She paced the narrow living room, the floor creaking beneath her. Each step was a beat of rage suppressed. She stopped in front of the window and looked out, just rows of rooftops, cars, people walking dogs. Life as usual, but not for her. Tina turned away, walked into the bathroom, and stood before the mirror. Her reflection stared back like a challenge. The bruises on her arms were fading into yellow. Her eyes were sunken, ringed with sleepless nights. But beneath that tired exterior burned something primal. Not revenge, not desperation, conviction, and behind that conviction, memory. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, strong as steel. Justice isn't delivered to your doorstep, baby. You have to go out and drag it back, kicking and screaming if you must. Her mother hadn't lived to see the medals Tina earned, but she would have seen the truth in this moment. Tina wiped her face, squared her shoulders, and walked to the small desk shoved against the wall. It was cluttered with unopened mail, unpaid bills, and a photo frame, her mother, holding her tight in a uniform far too big for a girl that young. She sat down and pulled out a notepad. First line, written in bold strokes. They won't bury me quietly. Then came the checklist. Medical report, already in her possession. Detailed, time-stamped, notarized. Photographs included, dash cam footage, her car's front camera. She pulled the memory card from the glove box weeks ago, but hadn't dared open the file. Until now. Phone data, the recording she started before being pulled from the car. She replayed the audio. Langston's voice was clear, hostile, threatening. Get out now. Turn off that phone. You think that ID makes you special? Every word was a nail. She downloaded everything to an encrypted drive, created backup folders, uploaded them to a private cloud. She'd learned the hard way in combat redundancy wasn't paranoia. It was survival. Then came the digital trail. She searched online forums where others had spoken out against Officer Langston. Most threads were locked, comments closed, or suspiciously violated community guidelines. But screenshots lived forever. Tina began saving everything. Names, dates, patterns. She opened an email to the city clerk's office and submitted a FOIA request for every complaint ever filed against Langston. She knew most would be lost, incomplete, or under internal review. Still, requesting it put them on notice. The war had begun, but this war wasn't fought with bullets. It was fought with evidence. Her fingers moved across the keyboard like a soldier assembling a weapon. Her eyes scanned screens like she used to scan terrain looking for threats, for movement, for holes in enemy lines. She was building a case, one they couldn't ignore, one too loud to bury. She dug deeper into her own phone records, found the time-stamped text she sent to her friend right before being pulled over. Cop following me? Not sure why. It was short, but it was proof. She screenshot it, filed it, added it to the growing mountain. By midnight, her desk was a battlefield of documents, hard drives, and open tabs. Her apartment, quiet, cold, forgotten, had transformed into a war room. Outside, the city slept. Inside, Tina prepared for war. She took one last look at her list, each box marked, each lead pursued. And then she wrote one final line at the bottom of the page. They silenced the wrong woman. Tina sat hunched over her laptop at the small, flickering kitchen table, the glow from the screen casting hard shadows on her face. The walls of her apartment were covered with sticky notes, printed documents, a growing web of red string, and highlighter markings that mapped a different kind of battlefield. At the center of it all, Officer Langston. 12 complaints. 12 separate citizens, mostly black, some Latino, one Middle Eastern, had filed formal reports against him over the last 6 years. Racial profiling, physical intimidation, unlawful stops, escalated force. But every single file had been closed due to lack of evidence or dismissed for procedural error. Some had vanished altogether, deleted, buried, or altered. It wasn't incompetence, it was orchestration. Langston's pattern wasn't random. He targeted the vulnerable, the invisible, the people least likely to be believed, most likely to be silenced. Tina knew she wasn't alone. The system had tried to make her feel like an exception, but she wasn't. She was part of a pattern, and that meant others had survived the same treatment. She just had to find them. It took weeks of digging old Facebook posts, archived forums, whispered tips from anonymous contacts. She cross-referenced timestamps, police logs, neighborhood crime reports. It was like building a puzzle where half the pieces had been set on fire. But slowly the outlines began to appear. The first she found was Jerome Davis, a 38-year-old delivery driver who had once been forced out of his van at gunpoint by Langston because his taillight was suspicious. No citation, just humiliation. Jerome refused to answer Tina's first 2 calls. On the third, he picked up but only said 4 words. I don't do this. Tina didn't try to change his mind. She just said, he did it to me too. A pause, then, you got cuffs or bruises? Both, she answered, and a record that never should have existed. Jerome exhaled. Meet me tomorrow. Coffee spot on 8th. When they met, he sat stiffly, arms crossed, scanning the cafe like he expected Langston to walk through the door. His voice was low, as if the walls could hear. He told me no one would believe me. Told me I fit the description. I never filed again after that first complaint vanished. Tina listened, not just with her ears, but with the weight of someone who had lived the same fear. When he finished, she asked only one thing. Would you be willing to tell your story again this time, with me standing next to you? He didn't answer right away. But when he nodded, it was enough. Next came Maria Alvarez. She was only 19 when it happened, pulled from her car, accused of transporting drugs. The drugs turned out to be a protein shake in a gym bag. She never told her parents. Her voice shook when she recounted it. Langston had laughed as he searched her, said she fit the profile. When she tried to file a report, it was rewritten to say she was belligerent and refused to cooperate. "I thought maybe I imagined how bad it really was," Maria whispered. "But now I know. I didn't." Tina reached across the table and placed her hand over Maria's. "You didn't imagine it. He made you question your own memory. That's how abusers survive." The stories poured in, quiet at first, then louder. Each one followed the same formula. Stop, accuse, intimidate, release no charges, no record, just trauma. Each story had ended with silence. Until now. Tina recorded everything. She didn't sensationalize, she documented. Dates, times, exact quotes, where it happened, how, what Langston said, what the officers with him didn't say. She began building a timeline. The more she uncovered, the clearer it became. This wasn't the story of one rogue cop. This was a system built on rot, but still many victims were afraid. "I got kids," one man said. "You know what happens when you start poking around these people?" Tina nodded. "I understand. You don't have to go public. Just let me use your story. We'll protect your identity." She gave every person control over how their account was used. No pressure, no shame, just truth. Because Tina knew what it felt like to be powerless, and she was done letting others feel the same. In between meetings, she barely slept. She spent her nights compiling testimony, scanning police records, cross-checking addresses and badge numbers. Her eyes were bloodshot, her body sore, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. One night, staring at her wall of names, redacted reports and printed maps, she whispered to herself, "You built your kingdom on silence, Langston. I'm burning it down with voices." She took all her findings and drafted a 37-page report. She didn't send it to the press. Not yet. She sent it to the victims. Let them read it. Let them see that they weren't alone. One by one, messages came in. "Use my name. Tell them I said it. Enough is enough." Tina Sanders had lit a fuse, and the system didn't even know it was standing on gunpowder. The fight for justice is just beginning. More shocking twists are ahead. Don't miss a moment. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for standing for truth and justice. Where are you watching from? Let us know. It started with a shaky phone camera and a silent witness. A pedestrian, waiting at a crosswalk across the street, had pulled out their phone instinctively, something about the way the officer's voice cut through the morning air. The video was only 10 seconds long, grainy, unfiltered, raw. But it captured the precise moment Officer Derek Langston shoved Tina Sanders against her car with violent force. The sound of her body hitting the hood was sickening. Langston's voice, cold, sharp, commanding, was unmistakable. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Tina's voice followed, calm but pained. "You're hurting me." Then the clip ended. No context, no background. Just a white officer manhandling a black woman in broad daylight, while she stood still, composed and unarmed. The video was posted anonymously to a local community page with a simple caption, "Is this how we're still being treated?" It spread like wildfire. Within hours, it was reposted to Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Influencers, activists, and even news personalities began sharing it, demanding answers. The hashtags exploded. "Justice for Tina, who is she?" Langston exposed. The comments poured in. She didn't resist, he just snapped. Where's the accountability? If this is what happens on camera, imagine what happens off it. In less than 24 hours, the video had crossed 3 million views. It had become more than a viral clip, it was a flashpoint. A mirror to a truth many already knew, that the system doesn't protect everyone equally, that some officers operate like predators, shielded by silence and bureaucracy. And then came the shift. Voices that had once been buried by fear, by shame, by disbelief began to rise. Jerome Davis, the former delivery driver Tina had spoken with weeks earlier, posted a tweet that echoed across timelines like a war drum. He did it to me too. I didn't speak then, but I see her now. I remember that look on my own face. I'm done being quiet. The replies flooded in. Survivors, witnesses, allies. Maria Alvarez uploaded a video, her voice trembling as she held up the same gym bag Langston had once accused of hiding drugs. This was the evidence that ruined my record. He lied. I was 19. I never forgot what he said to me. You people always run your mouths. The courage spread like electricity. A former teacher, a young mother, a gas station clerk. Each had been targeted by Langston. Each had once believed no one would care. But now the world cared. Tina, watching it unfold from her small apartment, didn't flinch. She didn't post. She didn't tweet. She simply leaned forward, eyes locked on the screen, absorbing the surge of long overdue justice. Her name hadn't even been revealed yet, but her presence, her defiance was already reshaping the narrative. The police department issued a vague statement by noon the next day. We are aware of the video circulating and are reviewing the incident in accordance with departmental procedures. It was too little, too late, because people weren't asking anymore. They were demanding. This wasn't a headline. It was an uprising. And Tina Sanders? She had just become the symbol of everything the system tried to bury. Tina knew the moment had come. The video had lit the match. The victims' voices had become the wind. But if she wanted real justice, tangible, undeniable, irreversible, she needed more than outrage. She needed strategy, and she knew exactly who to call. She hadn't spoken to Marcus Lee in nearly a decade. Once a military legal officer under her command, he was now a rising force in the federal justice system, one of the youngest U.S. assistant attorneys in his district. She didn't know if he'd pick up. She didn't know if he'd remember. But she had nothing left to lose. She dialed. Marcus Lee, came the crisp voice on the other end. There was a pause, then, Colonel Sanders? Tina closed her eyes for half a second, that name stirring ghosts of war zones and mission briefings. Not anymore, she said. Just Tina now. Hell no, Marcus replied, voice shifting into something warmer, steel-laced with memory. You'll always outrank me. What's going on? She didn't ease in. There was no time. I was assaulted, wrongfully detained. Officer Derek Langston silence. I have medical records, dash cam footage, witness accounts, and now public outcry. I've found 12 other victims, most people of color, complaints buried, evidence lost. 12? Marcus cut in, voice sharp now, legal instincts fully engaged. At least I've built a case file, but I need teeth. I need the law behind it. He didn't hesitate. Send everything, right now. I'll call in the Civil Rights Unit. If this is half as strong as you say, we're going to war. Tina's grip tightened on the phone. Finally, someone who didn't flinch. Someone who didn't look away. She uploaded the encrypted folder within minutes. Hundreds of documents, photos, video clips, sworn statements, a digital arsenal. By the time Marcus called her back, his voice was lower, focused. This isn't just misconduct, he said. This is systemic abuse and departmental negligence. We're talking pattern and practice, civil rights violations under color of law. We can go federal with this. Tina didn't respond right away, because for the first time in weeks, justice didn't feel like a fantasy. It felt real, tactical, inevitable. We're going to hit them where they're weakest, Marcus continued. Through the courts, through the press, through oversight. Tina looked at her wall of evidence, in the photos, at the names, at her mother's quote scribbled in bold letters above everything. No one brings justice to your door. You fight for it. And now, finally, she wasn't fighting alone. This wasn't revenge. This was the beginning of a legal assault they would never see coming. The internal affairs hearing room was colder than Tina expected. Metal chairs, stone gray walls, and a silence so tight it could strangle. At the center of it all sat Officer Derek Langston, dressed in full uniform, trying to project calm. But the twitch in his jaw and the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. Across from him, a long table held 5 members of the Internal Review Board, their faces unreadable, pens poised, eyes sharp. This was no routine check-in. This was war in a courtroom. And then the door opened. Tina Sanders entered like a storm in slow motion. She wore her full military dress uniform dark blue, gleaming metals pinned with precision, posture so perfect it made the room straighten subconsciously. Her boots echoed off the tile as she marched forward, every step a declaration. I will not be erased. She didn't glance at Langston, didn't need to. He felt her presence like fire licking at his collar. She placed a thick black binder on the evidence table, then a flash drive, then a sealed folder with an official notarization. She stood tall as the chair of the board addressed her. Lieutenant Colonel Sanders, thank you for your attendance. You may proceed. Tina opened the binder slowly, deliberately. This document contains my full testimony, supported by medical reports, dash cam footage, and witness statements. Also included documentation of 12 previous complaints made against Officer Langston, most of them filed by civilians of color, all of them dismissed or lost. She handed each board member a copy. Langston's attorney stood. Objection to the introduction of unrelated complaints? The board chair raised a hand. Sit down, counselor. We'll determine relevance. Tina remained still. She pressed a button on the remote. Behind her, the monitor lit up. Play. The room watched in silence as the infamous video clip played. Langston shouting, shoving Tina against her car, his voice laced with aggression, hers steady and clear. You're hurting me. The clip ended. The silence it left behind was deafening. Tina's voice sliced through it like a blade. That video is only 10 seconds long, but for me, it lasted 16 hours. 16 hours in a cold cell without food, water, or explanation. 16 hours of silence, humiliation, and erasure. I was treated not as a veteran, not as a citizen, but as a threat without cause. She paused, letting the weight of her words land. I have led troops in combat. I have buried soldiers under flags, but nothing prepared me for being brutalized on my own soil by someone sworn to protect it. Langston shifted in his seat. Sweat had begun to form along his hairline. Tina looked directly at the board now. This isn't just about me. It's about the pattern, the protection, the silence that has allowed this man to keep his badge, despite years of complaints. Complaints that were buried until now. She clicked again. Testimony videos began to play victims, speaking out. A man wrongly cuffed, a young woman dragged from her car, a teacher forced to the ground in front of his students. Face after face, voice after voice, truth after truth. Tina turned back to the panel. You cannot unsee what you've seen. You cannot unhear what's been said. You can no longer pretend this was an isolated incident. Tina had spoken her truth. She had laid the facts bare and pierced the silence with unshakable resolve. But what came next was something no one, especially Officer Langston, was prepared for. Because when one woman stands up, she doesn't rise alone. She ignites a movement. They came one by one, quiet at first, not in suits, not with headlines, but with truth in their hands and courage in their eyes. Jerome Davis arrived in a faded jacket and a steel determination. Maria Alvarez walked in clutching a folder that held the memory of a night she'd tried to forget. Behind them came more people once silenced, people once broken. Now they stood together, shoulder to shoulder, refusing to disappear. The hallway outside the Internal Affairs hearing room swelled with tension. News cameras lined the corridor. Microphones hovered like vultures. But inside, it wasn't chaos. It was reckoning. As Officer Derek Langston sat back down after Tina's devastating testimony, the door opened again. The board chair raised an eyebrow as more civilians entered. Not spectators, witnesses. One by one, they stepped forward and identified themselves. Not with rage, but with resolve. My name is Jerome Davis, one man said, his voice hoarse. Officer Langston cuffed me in front of my kids for jogging in my own neighborhood. I'm Maria Alvarez, said the next. He dragged me from my car and called me a liar. I was 19, still have nightmares. The board was stunned. Their expressions, once rigid, cracked under the avalanche of human truth. This wasn't testimony. This was a rising. Each statement wasn't just an accusation. It was a brick torn from the wall of silence Langston had built for years. Tina stood at the back, arms folded, watching as the dam finally burst. These weren't just victims. They were survivors, warriors, and now they were a force, a justice force. She was called forward once more, this time not just as a witness, but as a leader. She stepped to the podium, the room still heavy with emotion. Dressed in her uniform, her chest rose and fell with the weight of generations behind her. And when she spoke, the room held its breath. "I want to thank each of you who stood up today," she began, her voice calm but sharp. "Because we've been told for too long that silence is safer, that speaking up will cost us everything, and sometimes it does. But what it costs us to stay silent is so much worse." She looked directly at the panel, then at the rows of victims seated behind her. Officer Langston operated with the confidence of a man who believed the system would always protect him, and for a long time it did. But not because he deserved it, because too many people stayed quiet. Too many people looked away. Her voice began to rise clear, commanding, powerful. Justice cannot be a luxury afforded only to the privileged. It cannot be something granted based on skin color, zip code, or who you know. Justice is not charity. Justice is a right. It is not a favor to be earned. It is the foundation of any society that dares call itself free. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. "We didn't come here today just to speak. We came to be heard. To remind you that behind every complaint buried in a file drawer, there is a human being, a mother, a father, teenager with a future that was nearly shattered by a badge used like a weapon." She paused, locking eyes with Langston, who now stared at the table, his hands trembling slightly. "You thought you could silence us with fear," she said, her voice steady and low. "But fear is a fuel, and we've burned it into something stronger." She turned back to the panel. "Look around you. These people are not victims anymore. They are a movement. They are proof that no system, no officer, no institution is above accountability." A long silence followed. No gavel, no interruptions. Just a room forced to witness the power of truth spoken by the people it once tried to forget. Outside, reporters scrambled to capture the moment. Hashtags trended. Video clips of Tina's speech lit up social media. But inside the hearing room, something deeper happened. Faces that once held doubt now held conviction. The officials began whispering to one another. Papers shuffled. Decisions stirred. And in the middle of it all stood Tina, calm, tall, unflinching, flanked by those who had once been afraid to stand at all. In that moment, the illusion of invincibility that had protected Langston for years crumbled. Because he wasn't just being judged by a board anymore. He was being judged by the people, by the truth, by justice, finally given a voice it couldn't ignore. The verdict came down like a lightning strike. No press conference, no warning. Just a plain white envelope delivered to Officer Derek Langston's desk that morning, his name typed at the top. The words underneath? Cold, Director, Final. Effective immediately, Officer Derek Langston is hereby terminated from the Riverside Police Department. His law enforcement certification is revoked. He is to surrender his badge, weapon, and department-issued equipment by end of day. He stared at the letter, hands trembling, jaw clenched. A career built on intimidation gone in a single page. But it wasn't just a termination, it was an unmasking. The badge that once made him feel invincible was now a symbol of disgrace, and it didn't end there. Before Langston could even process the sting of losing his position, another document was handed to him, this one from the district attorney's office. Criminal charges filed, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, false arrest, excessive use of force. Tampering with official records, the final line sealed it. To be arraigned in federal court pending indictment. Langston had spent years throwing others into handcuffs. Now he faced the same fate. The headlines exploded within hours. Riverside officer fired, criminally charged after viral abuse case. Tina Sanders sparks nationwide probe into police misconduct. 12 complaints reopened, justice delayed, but not denied. For Tina, it wasn't satisfaction that washed over her. It was vindication, not just for herself, but for every name buried in silence, every report that had been dismissed, every civilian who had walked out of a station broken and unheard. She didn't smile when the news broke. She stood still, strong, silent, steady, because this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of accountability. The Internal Review Board, under mounting pressure and public demand, issued a rare second announcement that same week. All past complaints involving Officer Derek Langston will be reopened and reviewed independently. Where applicable, reparations and settlements will be considered for victims. It was an unprecedented move. The board appointed a civilian oversight committee to re-examine the buried files boxes of complaints that had once been misplaced, lost in transition, or closed without merit. Now they were evidence. Now they mattered. Jerome Davis received a phone call 3 days later. For the first time in years, someone from the department said the words he thought he'd never hear. "We're sorry. We failed you." Maria Alvarez, once told to forget what happened to her, received a formal apology letter and an invitation to testify at a police oversight hearing about systemic bias. Each victim was no longer a statistic. They were witnesses, survivors, voices of change. One by one, restitution offers followed along with mental health services, legal support, and formal acknowledgments of wrongdoing. The city had been shaken. But Tina? She kept moving. When asked for a statement, she walked out of the courthouse steps in uniform, flanked by several of the survivors. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted her name. She raised a hand and the noise fell away. Her voice was calm, but each word landed like a hammer. Justice isn't a moment, it's a movement. What happened to me and to every person who stood behind me was not an accident. It was the result of a system designed to silence us. But we stood anyway, and now the silence is broken. She paused, scanning the crowd. Faces of pain, of hope, of awakening. To those still afraid to speak, we hear you. To those who've been ignored, we believe you. And to those who once abused their power behind a badge, know this: the shield is not yours to hide behind anymore. A beat of silence, then thunderous applause. Reporters rushed forward. Officials whispered among themselves. But Tina walked off the podium, not basking in glory, marching toward what came next. Because the truth wasn't just exposed, it was mobilized. Langston, once feared, now sat behind a defense table in handcuffs, his eyes downcast. His name synonymous with disgrace. The courtroom that once upheld his word now prepared to judge his crimes. His attorney whispered strategies in vain. The evidence was overwhelming. The public was watching. The truth had teeth. And Tina? She sat in the front row, a silent sentinel, not to celebrate, but to witness what justice looked like when it finally caught up. The system that had tried to bury her had been forced to dig itself out of the grave it created. Langston's world didn't collapse in an instant. It was dismantled brick by the people he thought would never be heard. And leading them was the woman he thought he could silence. Tina Sanders didn't just survive the system, she changed it. And for the first time in a long time, the badge meant something again. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. The war was over, but Tina Sanders didn't parade through the streets. There were no banners bearing her name, no red carpets or golden plaques. The world had seen what she had done, how she took on the system, exposed the rot, and helped bring a decorated, protected officer to justice. But she wasn't interested in becoming a symbol. She had already bled for one flag in her lifetime. She didn't need another draped over her shoulders to prove her worth. Still, the calls came. The governor's office invited her to speak. National networks wanted exclusive interviews. Advocacy groups offered awards, dinners, honorary titles. She declined them all. Except one. It was a letter hand-delivered signed by the State Commissioner of Public Safety. Ms. Sanders, we are forming a task force to rebuild trust between communities and law enforcement across the state. We believe your voice, your experience, your leadership is vital. We don't want a figurehead. We want a fighter. Will you advise us? It was the first time an invitation felt real. She didn't accept immediately. She spent a week walking the same streets where she'd once been cuffed, ignored, and dehumanized. She looked into the faces of strangers, some who now recognized her, some who nodded with quiet respect, some who still looked away. Then she said yes, but not for the title, not for recognition, for the work. She became a ghost behind reform crafting training protocols on use of force, implementing accountability standards, and requiring trauma-informed de-escalation courses for all state officers. She brought in psychologists, veteran trainers, and former victims, people who had seen power at its worst. She didn't yell in boardrooms. She didn't rage. She laid facts on the table with a calm that unsettled the unprepared. This isn't about punishment, she said during one of the first sessions. It's about prevention. You want to change the future? Then train differently, lead differently, and start listening to the people you swore to protect. Her recommendations became policy. Her case became curriculum. And yet, she never stayed long in the spotlight. By the time the first round of reforms passed, Tina had already returned to the one place that truly mattered to her, the Veteran Center. It was quiet there, humble, just as she remembered. The director met her at the door with tears in his eyes and shame in his voice. "I'm sorry we turned our back on you," he said. Tina nodded. "Just don't turn your back on the next one. No bitterness, no ego, just truth." She slipped into her old routine as if she had never left organizing supplies, mentoring new vets, running early morning drills in the dusty parking lot with a stopwatch and an unforgiving stare. It wasn't about redemption, it was about purpose. In the back room of the center, she gathered a new group of recruits, young, wide-eyed, eager but bruised by life. Some were fresh out of service, others were trying to find their place again. All of them carried invisible scars. Tina stood in front of them, arms crossed, voice steady. "I'm not here to inspire you. I'm here to train you. Life out there isn't fair. People won't care what you survived, but you will stand anyway. And when the world pushes, you push back. Not with hate, with discipline, with facts, with truth." The room was silent, hanging on every word. "Some of you are going to see things you can't unsee. Some of you already have. But you have to remember one thing." She paused. Her eyes scanned the room. And then, with quiet power, she spoke her final lesson. "I didn't win because I was stronger. I won because I didn't quit." The recruits said nothing, but something inside them shifted. Because in that room, in that quiet little building with peeling walls and mismatched chairs, justice wasn't a courtroom or a press conference. It was a woman in uniform, standing tall in the aftermath of a storm she refused to be broken by. Tina turned away from the front of the room and walked to the chalkboard, scribbling out drills and routines as if nothing had changed. But outside the center, the world had, because of her. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of real change kept echoing, slow, steady, undeniable. Just like her. The courtroom had emptied. The reporters had packed away their microphones, and the headlines had moved on to the next sensation. But Tina Sanders stood alone in the aftermath, breathing slowly as she stepped outside the courthouse, watching as the midday sun cast long shadows on the marble stairs. Behind her, a chapter of injustice had finally closed. Yet for her, the fight had only just begun. Within days, calls flooded her voicemail. State officials praised her courage. Activists applauded her resilience. Politicians sought photo opportunities. It was overwhelming, suffocating even. But Tina didn't seek glory. All she'd ever wanted was fairness, justice that didn't require a battle. Late one afternoon, she received an unexpected call from an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end was authoritative, direct, and respectful. "Lieutenant Colonel Sanders, this is Michael Porter, Commissioner of Public Safety. I want to speak plainly. Our state's police force is fractured. The public trust is shattered. Your story exposed wounds we can no longer ignore. We need someone who understands the fight from the inside. Someone who faced injustice firsthand and conquered it. We'd be honored if you joined our task force as a senior advisor for statewide police reform." Tina listened carefully, her hand gripping the phone tightly. It wasn't the first offer she'd received, but something about this one felt genuine. It wasn't praise disguised as politics. It was a recognition of her battle, an acknowledgement of her scars. "I appreciate the offer, Commissioner," she replied, her voice calm yet firm. "But if I agree, it's not to put my name on your brochures or shake hands for the cameras. I'll do it quietly. No speeches, no awards. I understand, the commissioner replied after a brief pause. We need real change, not publicity stunts. And just like that, she said yes, not for herself, but for every name she carried with her. Jerome Davis, Maria Alvarez, and countless others who had suffered silently for too long. Her first meeting with the Reform Committee was held in a simple, unassuming conference room. There were no banners, no catered meals, just a circle of determined faces ready to confront hard truths. Tina arrived dressed simply, without fanfare. She entered quietly, but her presence was commanding, drawing the room's attention instantly. Let's start with honesty, she began, skipping formal introductions. The problem isn't just a few bad officers. The system itself protects them. It silences complaints, hides evidence, and discourages accountability. Change won't come from surface fixes or feel-good policies. Real reform will hurt. It will expose things some prefer hidden. Are you prepared for that? The silence that followed was heavy, filled with tension. But slowly heads began to nod. Tina continued, outlining policies designed not just to punish misconduct, but to prevent it altogether. Mandatory accountability training, independent civilian oversight boards, body cam requirements, and new standards for officer evaluations. Her words cut like a surgeon's scalpel, precise, unyielding, and necessary. As the weeks passed, Tina worked tirelessly behind the scenes. She drafted reports, attended late-night meetings, reviewed endless policy drafts, and personally interviewed victims who once thought their voices had been lost forever. She became the quiet engine driving the reform effort, and soon the entire state felt the force of her quiet, relentless determination. Yet despite all the change she orchestrated, she never appeared in press conferences. She declined public appearances. She refused honorary titles and politely rejected invitations to gala dinners and ceremonies. Her voice was strong enough without fanfare, her presence loud enough without speeches. Months later, as reforms took hold and public trust gradually began to mend, Tina quietly withdrew from the spotlight entirely. She knew the true fight wasn't in the headlines or halls of power, it was in the hearts and minds of those she'd vowed to serve. And so she returned home, to the modest veteran center that had once turned her away in fear. She stood outside the familiar brick building, pausing briefly, remembering the sting of betrayal she'd felt when they cut ties. But bitterness was fleeting. She pushed the door open gently, stepping into the quiet lobby filled with memories. Faces turned toward her. Expressions of surprise, guilt, and quiet admiration filled the room. After a moment, the director approached hesitantly, shame shadowing his eyes. "Tina, we made a terrible mistake," he began softly, remorse thickening his voice. "We let fear guide our decisions. I have no excuse, but please know you always have a place here." She didn't smile, but her eyes softened slightly. "Just make sure the center never turns its back on another veteran again. That's all I ask." Returning to her former role, Tina quietly organized weekly sessions for young veterans. She ran daily drills in the gym, offered mentorship late into the night, and shared stories around coffee tables where laughter and tears mingled freely. Gradually, the center came alive again under her guidance, not through speeches or celebrations, but through quiet actions, small gestures, and relentless patience. One afternoon, a young veteran named Alex approached her hesitantly after training. His voice was uncertain, still wounded by battles unseen. "Colonel Sanders, can I ask you something personal?" She nodded gently. "Go ahead." "After everything you faced after the arrest, the injustice, the isolation, how did you keep fighting? Why didn't you just quit?" Tina paused, weighing her words carefully, her gaze fixed on a distant memory. She thought of cold concrete floors, bruised wrists, and the crushing silence of betrayal. She thought of the nights alone, the days ignored, the weeks that felt like an endless tunnel of despair. But more vividly, she remembered her mother's quiet strength and her enduring lesson about justice. When she finally answered, her voice was strong but gentle, her words measured but powerful. "Alex, it's simple. The world isn't always fair, and it isn't always kind. When I was thrown in that cell, treated like a criminal, and abandoned by almost everyone I trusted, I faced a choice. Not between victory and defeat, but between standing up or staying down. There were nights I didn't know if I'd make it, times when the loneliness felt heavier than anything I'd faced in war. But each time I felt ready to quit, I thought of everyone who came before me, who fought battles much harder than mine, people who stood up even when the world pushed them down, people who chose courage over comfort. She leaned forward slightly, meeting Alex's gaze directly. You asked why I didn't quit? Because quitting would mean accepting a world that silences voices like ours. It would mean saying injustice is acceptable. It isn't. It never will be. I wasn't stronger, braver, or smarter than anyone else who stood in my place before me. I just chose, again and again, to stand back up, to push through, to keep going. Justice isn't about who's strongest, it's about who refuses to give up.